At the end of your life, increasingly, you're going to have to make decisions about what treatments you will or will not have. And this is where you need wisdom. We all hope that when we get to the end of our lives, the physician who is in charge of our ending, so to speak, will be wise. It's by no means certain, which is why every church, in my view, should have a power of attorney program given to people who share your beliefs for the end of life, so that they can turn up in the ICU or wherever you are unfortunate enough to arrive and see that nothing is done which is not consistent with what you believe. Now, I've seen now the first papers that I've come across on a subject I've been waiting for some time, and that is not to look just at whether we can do certain things at any age. We can, but what is the longer-term outcome? And it was predictable, and the first papers in this area that I've come across, and if any of you know any more or any detailed review of this area, I'd love to have it, show that yes, you can still technically do the things and get the people off the OR table and into the ICU and maybe even get them further, but a total recovery is much less likely when you're my age. There are a lot of operations and a lot of medical treatments too that I am not going to take because I want my final days to be ones in which I can communicate with those I love and with those who wish to talk to me, who might find some comfort and some help in what comes out of it. That's the most important thing for me. Robert Spitzer taught me years ago that the last 6 weeks of life is the most important for human reconciliation. Don't leave this world with unreconciled feuds going on. And I mean, humans are like that. We hold grudges for years in the most stupid way, but it's what we do. You need to get rid of those. If you have an unacceptable relationship with some people and you can see the end in sight, get it resolved. People who fell out years ago and they continued the state of being fallen out but have forgotten why it started, then one hears the other is sick and you go and say, I'm sorry to hear you're so sick, and you end up hugging one another and reconciling and saying, what did we do? We used to have such a good friendship and we lost it. I can't even remember why. Some people are so attached to their sense of being misused that they don't forget it. And that, of course, is really damaging. If you do not forgive, you will not be forgiven, says Christ, in the only sentence that's an effective repeat of a previous sentence in the Sermon on the Mount. That's how important it is. And it comes after the end of the Lord's Prayer. I think we should put it to every week with the Lord's Prayer because there's so many relationships that require forgiveness. So, all that to say that when you get to the end of your life, you need somebody who shares your understanding of what life is about, who would give the same answers or at least have sympathy with the answers to where did I come from, why am I here, where am I going? What can I know? What ought I to believe? What ought I to do? When you're facing the end of life, those questions become more important. So you need to be able to talk to them with your physician or have somebody that you can talk to who will talk to the physician with respect and receive respect. If a church does get organized a power of attorney program so that end-of-life decisions are not made by your family who are in distress, but by people who've thought about what you believe and what it would logically lead to, they would soon become welcome visitors to the local intensive care units because much that's done in medicine nowadays is a result of lawyers and doctors set about preventing that as far as they can. And so they do things not for the good of the patient, but for the preservation of their own income, their own life. COVID was an example. I mean, now we're at the stage where reassessments are happening, and they're not good news for the administrators, but they're papering over the cracks and giving awards to people who were actually not up for the job they were supposed to be doing. At least the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration, who got it right. I mean, no serious person is going to say, who knows the literature and knows what happened, is going to say that it was right to cancel them. They'll try and defend what they did, of course, particularly people like Fauci will. But no, the signers of that declaration were basically a Swedish-trained epidemiologist, J. Bhattacharya from Stanford, and a woman whose name I don't remember, sadly, from Oxford. And what they said was right, proved to be right retrospectively, because Sweden was the only place that did it exactly as they said, and they have, without question, some of the best results in the world for outcomes, particularly the area which there's great attempts to deny, that is the excess death rates in certain categories, like young men at the start of their careers. The giveaway, of course, is I hope I'm wrong on this and that there will soon be proper publications of QALY data, quality adjusted life years. If you're looking at long-term outcomes, then it's a crude measure, but it's worth doing. And I have no doubt that the reason there is no data is that there were some lives saved, but they were mainly saved in people who'd only got a year or two to go anyway. So you don't get many quality adjusted life years coming from that group, like me and older. But if a 20-year-old dies, you've lost 60 years of productive income for the economy. That's a lot of quality adjusted life years that are lost. And they were lost, in my view. The evidence seems to me pretty strong that some responsibility needs to be taken for that. That's where we're at. So back to briefly Mary Harrington. She, in this book, which is where I found the Leo Strauss quotation, by the way, describes her own life and how she was plucked as a brand from the burning by her intellectual honesty. She realized she wanted a baby, and she wanted that baby to have a proper upbringing, and she got it right. And she describes very movingly how that baby took hold of her, this little scrap of humanity, which excited in her an absolutely obsessive need to care for it. The baby changed her life. She realized that deep down she required to be a mother. And she writes about differences between males and females in very interesting ways. And it's got a lot of stuff in for anybody who's got a young family about to leave the safety of home and go through puberty, which nowadays is disastrous. I mean, in many public schools, they've already been told a whole bunch of things that are not true, like you can be whatever you like, a male or a female. It's just a matter of your decision. And then the docs will make it work. Well, the docs can't make it work. They haven't made it work. It's disastrous. And in most cases, except a very small group of men who usually put it off for a long while, but in the end do the gender-adjusted surgery and have what appears to be successful lives afterwards. But that's a very, very small group. But the almost, what should I say, infectious movement, especially amongst girls, to get mastectomies, that can't be fixed. And Harrington talks about that in a real way. So as reverting to where I got off track, issue of how you teach in the university these days. What's the primary requirement? And I would say one of the most important things to do is to start getting them to be much, much more concerned with critiques of what is published than memorizing what is published as though it's bound to be true. I mean, we now know that about 80% or more of the scientific literature has not been validated and may indeed be false. Bhattacharya, one of the victims of the COVID fiasco, is now head of NIH, and he has said that he is very keen to set up programs where the young can get grants in order to repeat work that has important implications but has never been repeated. By doing that, they will hone their own minds and intellects, and they will also learn some good techniques. That would be, I think that's a wonderful idea, because the current system, again, is run by the people at the top who have their own ideas. In the postdoctoral system that we have now means that you are forcing bright young people to do other people's ideas, to work out other people's ideas, the boss, at their own period of peak performance, instead of being set free to get on with it and see what is produced. I mean, the major contributions in almost every field are not made by 50 or 60-year-olds. They're made by 20 and 30-year-olds. That's the moment of explosive new ideas. And we sort of squash it into the postdoctoral mesh, which then leads you into being less excited about what you do, and therefore less good as an inspirer of the young. Tom Sowell's account of his own life, which I was listening to last night on Uncommon Knowledge, being interviewed by Peter Robinson. I didn't know he'd written that biography, and it's lovely to watch how a man who, from the beginning, was confrontational over any issues of truth, and he has an immense following, and everything he does is going to be read by a lot of people. I mean, he's written multiple books over the age of 80, is now in his mid-90s, and still functioning very well. But the bit of soul that I go back to again and again and again, whenever you see somebody saying such and such is the truth, it's going to be the building blocks for the next stage, soul suggests, before you change everything on the basis of this commitment, wouldn't it be a good idea to sit down and ask yourself, do we have any real comparative data with the way we used to think and this new way? Will it really be all blessings and showers of flowers from the intellectual superstructure? I don't think so. And he said, and then after that, before you push everybody in a new direction, like the transgender movement, should we not do some proper experiments? Now, of course, what they actually did was to sideline those pediatricians who had looked after these children with gender dysmorphia, dysfunction, whatever you want to call it, and had followed them for years and realized that if you get them through to post-puberty, most of them, 90% plus, become content with the body that they were given by God or nature. So that should have been, that data's solid. People who've walked with these kids, many of whom have other problems as well as their misunderstanding of their own gender, but they've got to know them, and they know the story. They were basically sidelined. You don't hear about them yet. You can dig them out, of course, because it's in the literature. But people who have got to know a disease by walking with patients who have that disease for 20, 30 years should be listened to. They have acquired respect in their local communities. I mean, they are in the long tradition of medicine. Medicine didn't change disease very much at all until the middle of the 19th century. But of course, you can't see patients every day. In all societies that are doctors in that sense, whether you call them natural healers or whatever, it doesn't really matter. But, there are people who take an interest in these things, and people go to see them because they are wise. They say, oh yeah, I've seen this. There's a lot of it going around at the moment. Most people are better in 3 weeks. You're okay. It's not going to kill you. But you can also have the opposite one where, because you've been doing this stuff for a long while and you know what's going on, you can say, I'm sorry, this is important. And it's not altogether good news. In some cases, it's very bad news. But people know when they are sick. And therapeutically, it's very important to them that they find out whether it is unto death, because that changes the way you live your life. You have things to get done. So what are we going to do? I mean, what has happened over the post-World War II domain of education has not been all good. Now, I'm a beneficiary of the fact that the universities opened their doors somewhat wider following the Second World War. So I, as a kid from a blue-collar background, got into medical school. Because of that, I wouldn't have got there without some level of affirmative action. Pretty small. I mean, it was 1 in 100 or 2 in 100 in the best school in Birmingham I got into, who were affirmative action kids. King Edward School, one of the best schools in England, had an entrance exam for 11-year-olds that included French and Latin, which was the way the upper classes manipulated the system in Britain to their own advantage, because the vast majority of Britons would never learn French or Latin at any stage in their lives, so by definition they could never go to that school. It was snide, but not strictly wrong. That's the way it was done. I don't think it was worked out that way. I think they sort of slid into that. So most of the kids who went to that school had lots of preparation for the entrance exam, whereas the boys who came from the working class, the only data they had on us was an IQ test. But as Jordan Peterson has pointed out, that's not a bad test, especially if you understand the way these things work, which is the next thing I needed to get students to start thinking about when they looked at data, because they simply had not been properly taught. So I taught a course on reading the scientific literature in the context of biochemistry and its applications in pediatrics, and how to do that. And I made a prerequisite for that course that you should have taken a course in statistics in your undergraduate program. And many of them had. And then I would draw a normal distribution curve on the board and ask them, what are the properties of that curve? Now, they had learned things about it, but they'd never been asked to think about it. So I never got an answer. It's just a description, they said. I said, but do you know that simply by the use of that curve in a clever way, in 20 years at that stage, we have halved the mortality rate in leukemia? Does that interest you? Of course it did. Then I'd draw 4 lines on the curve and ask them what those lines represented. And usually 1 or 2 in the class who knew. Certainly the 2 outer ones, which is 2 standard deviations, so that within those lines, 95% of the data is contained. The 2 right in the middle, near the mean or median, It's called the standard error of the mean, and that will allow you to compare two groups, because 95% of the time, if they overlap at that level, they're the same, but you can pull them apart that way. And in fact, ordinary, normal statistics, which is what that is, setting up groups, looking at the data and being able to say, well, that treatment is better than that one. So the progress in leukemia was made largely without new treatments, but using old treatments and looking at them and doing very careful, mind-numbing research. The same thing happened with the treatment of tuberculosis for the developing world. Finally, how long do you actually need to keep the treatment up? Because that has huge budgetary consequences. That's step one, if you like, in statistical thinking. Every human characteristic, height and weight and all the rest, are normally distributed by and large. And that allows you to identify real group differences. And that's not doing anything politically nasty, although some people construct it that way now. It's just what the mathematics show. Now, this week I also came across a beautiful practical example that you can go and find and enjoy for yourself. Everybody who's interested in these kinds of things has watched the lovely film on Turing, beautifully acted by one of my favorite actors whose name has disappeared at the moment, the solving of the Enigma code, which was the basic day-to-day instructions to where submarines should go and all the rest and where they would attack. And it's a lovely film. But what I didn't know until really the last month or so when I stumbled across it is that the education system that let me through, there were still some ways before it was easier for me, but a young man called Tutti, from a working class background in England, went to a village school, but his aptitude for mathematics was recognized, and he went off to Cambridge. I think he graduated in 1938, if I remember correctly, and was so doing postdoctoral work when the war came along. And mathematicians were sought after, and he went off to Bletchley, where Turing was working, but he was a loner in many ways, but a very kind and gentle person from what appeared in his life later. And he worked on his own at Bletchley pretty well, because there was another coded system, which was used by Hitler for communicating with the top level of his Nazi supporters. So what they were thinking about at the top level was coded in a different system, which was allegedly even more complex than the Enigma code. But Tutti sat down with pencil and paper and he deduced the structure of that machine. And he got it right. It's stunning. It's a little YouTube. You can find it. You just put Bill Tutte into it, Tuttee, and you'll find this young man who had a major impact on the outcome of the Second World War, and he gets virtually no credit. Everybody knows about Turing, which was actually an easier job than the Lorentz cipher, which is what he solved. Bless him, when the war was over, he ended up in Canada and was a much-loved professor teaching mathematics in the University of Waterloo in Ontario, where I live today. So I hope I've dropped enough little bombs into your life to get you reading one or two more things, thinking a bit more about them, particularly when you come to Mary Harrington. Some of what happens to people in their lives following the 1960s, she understands that the pill, the contraceptive pill, was a disaster. because it took intimacy and love out of sex relations. So she says, I don't know whether she's right or not, modern women only have a 10% probability in premarital sex of having real pleasure, orgasm. Yep. That's frighteningly awful. But she has many more things to point out that are being happening. And the girls are suffering. So if you've got daughters, the chapters that she has in this book, you should read and educate them, even though it will be difficult. I wish you success in getting the next generation through that will perhaps come back to higher standards. You see, when you start having entry into university based not on competence or measured skills or aptitudes, but on political considerations, you will dilute the whole. And that drags the whole system down. When Tutu went to the university, only 2 or 3% of the population of Britain went to university, so they were by definition all bright. No, that's not true. And what's really sad, and Tom Sowell is, I mean, he must have dealt with this. If anybody is at the top of his profession, he's one of them. He's also black. And he would undoubtedly have faced, although he would never take the victim role, because women and minority groups who get in are likely to have to live with the implied score, no, you're just an affirmative action prof or whatever, or the implication being that you're not really talented, you got in because that's what's so wrong. It spoils the atmosphere, and you lose that spark that happens when you have the privilege of being taught in a very small group by a very smart guy or woman. I mean, in my day, there were only the first few women were coming through to top positions. I worked for one of them who was great fun. That's disappeared. I hope we can bring it back in some way or another, because we need people who are unusual. There's that lovely moment in Jordan Peterson's career when he's on television in London, and the woman who's interviewing him is a smart woman, but not deeply educated, and she makes her living by being quick with words and making fools of very clever men, basically, is what she likes to do. So she unwisely invited Jordan Peterson. And the clip at the end of the interview is wonderful, because she, of course, brings up the whole chestnut of women being paid less for the same work as men. And the answer is, of course, no. As he says, when she brings this up, he said, don't you know about multivariate analysis? If you simply put as well as gender into that account, hours worked per year, you'll find that the conclusion you draw at that point is that men are being underpaid for the number of hours they put in. They work harder at their work because they have, in many cases, fewer social commitments, and their biology is different. Multivariate analysis, yeah. She didn't know anything of it, so she said, oh, you've got me. And he says, yes, I have. It's a wonderful ending. And of course, that video went viral in the millions, and his career took off like a rocket. Have a good week.